Alright guys, how's it going? I'm back with another video on AMD. This wasn't my intent this week, however, my other videos do require some deeper research, and I've watched hours of material to catch up on certain topics like artificial intelligence, deep learning, that kind of thing. However, that left me with not enough time to realistically do a video on it before the weekend. My vacation starts tomorrow and I'll be away from the PC entirely for at least a week. So I thought I'd do my Navi video as an emergency backup. This one's been on my mind for a few reasons, but again, after I chatted with the Radeon Business Unit VP and General Manager Scott Herkelman, as obviously Navi was a major talking point, and he was keen to put various points across. I can't discuss what we discussed, however, I can give you my updated thoughts with that in mind. So let's now discuss the problem with Navi, or more accurately, my problem with Navi. To start off with, yes, AMD offered me the chance to review Navi, but I declined. But Donnie got the cards for review on the website, and he did a really great review. But for me, reviews are just a monumental chore, and I don't have the Nvidia cards to really do them justice anyway. So there's a couple of reasons for why I would rather skip reviews. But there was more than just that. After we saw the performance and TDPs at AMD's E3 gaming event, I pretty much declared Navi as another disaster, architecturally at least, and I was not blown away by the $450 price either. The problem with Navi, my problem with Navi, is that in terms of performance per watt, looking over at Tech Power Up, and this is at 1440p, but the XT is still behind Pascal, the 1080 Ti in performance per watt, and the 1070-1080, and even the RX 5700, the more efficient of the two currently launched Navi cards. That's still behind cards like the 2070 Super and the RTX 2080 in performance per watt. And given that we are talking 7nm GPUs versus 12 and 16nm GPUs, I think it's fair to say that they are nowhere near Nvidia still on performance per watt. Scott agreed that Nvidia has very good performance per watt, and he suggested to me that it was possibly with the help of Tegra, Nvidia's mobile architecture. And if you remember, AMD sold off their mobile GPU tech to Qualcomm. Their handheld unit was sold back in 2009. So I could definitely see that, yeah, Tegra has helped Nvidia a lot regarding lowering power. They should have gained some expertise there. But this was also a very long time ago, and I think AMD has had plenty of chances to close the gap since Maxwell launched in 2013. That was the point. It was after Maxwell launched that Nvidia just pulled away in performance per watt by a mile. 6 years later, the gap has not closed. And I showed it in a recent video, Polaris just about matching Maxwell, but not quite. It's the exact same thing for Navi here. It's just about matching Pascal and Turing, but not quite. I've mentioned many times that AMD and previously ATI were often first to the latest process node. Going back as far as 2006, and they released the X1950 Pro, which was my first ever ATI GPU, and that was built on TSMC's 80nm process. At 230 square millimeters, this was a mid-range chip on a new process node. Back in 2006 though, this was actually quite a large chip, because GPU sizes really started to grow around about this time. Today this is mid-range, 2006 it's starting to get rather high-end, and this was launched around September, October of that year. Nvidia finally launched their first 80nm card a few months later, at the beginning of 2007, which was this Sparkle. Do you remember Sparkle? And a 7600 GT. And this GPU was only around about 100 square millimeters in size, which is still very much on the low end. Now, if you've watched many of my previous videos, you'll know that Nvidia generally fought ATI and AMD with larger chips on an older node. This wasn't the case back in 2006 though, where they had this smaller, faster and more power efficient chip on the previous 90nm node. This was G71 for the 7900 GTX, which on 90nm was only 196 square millimeters, so smaller than ATI's new 80nm RV570 for the X1950 Pro. And if we look at Anantech's review back then, we can see there's the X1950 XTX, which was the fastest graphics card at the time, but Nvidia's smaller 7900 GTX was a long way ahead of the X1950 Pro, even though it was a smaller GPU on the older process. And in fact, the 7900 GTX was not that far away from the X1950 XTX. That was AMD's flagship on 90nm, and it was 352 square millimeters. So very slightly faster, but much larger. And over at the tech report, we can see that it also consumes a lot more power. 270 watt system power against 226 watts for the 7900 GTX. And staying at the tech report, I found this comment by the author, Scott Wasson, interesting. In spite of the X1950 Pro's middle-class pedigree, RV570, that's the name of the chip, still gets membership of the Radeon X1950 Club. That's a departure from the past, when the GPU powering the video card determined its model number. ATI says performance, not silicon, now determines its naming scheme. So we can see that back then, ATI weren't afraid of upgrading their card's branding based on performance level. The issue here though appears to be that the X1950 Pro, which was a really nice card in its own right and well priced, it simply wasn't close to the X1950 XTX in performance. The XTX was about 50% faster, so that was a pretty poor branding choice by ATI. Now the next card to talk about is the HD 2900 XT. And this was the first GPU based on AMD's surprisingly successful Terascale architecture. Why is this surprising? It's surprising because the HD 2900 XT was an absolutely awful card. It was terribly late and it weighed in at a huge, for the time, 420 square millimeters die size. And this was on the same TSMC 18nm process. It was decently faster than the X1950 XTX. In most cases, but that wasn't the competing architecture. The competition was now Nvidia's wildly successful 8000 series, and the 8800 GTX in particular, a card which crushed the 2900 XT while using less power on 90nm. Oh dear. And over at AnandTech's conclusion, where they call a spade, AMD is not trying to pass this card off as something it's not. Rather than price the card out of its class, the R600 will find a good home at a reasonable price. So it was big, slow and power hungry, but at least it was cheap. Believe it or not though, the launch of the first 55nm card, the HD 3870, was only a few months away. AMD had launched lower-end 65nm parts for the HD 2000 series, but then they moved quickly on to the half-node 55nm with their new flagship, and also a return to competition. And at AnandTech again, we can see, on average, the Radeon HD 3870 gives us a 6 to 10% increase in performance over the more expensive, less featured, louder Radeon HD 2900 XT. And it has to be said, that's not a bad improvement over the course of only 6 months. This is why the GPU market was so interesting back then. But still though, for a new series, under 10% performance improvement? I mean, this is fairly abysmal stuff, but there was a reason for that lack of extra performance. And that was that AMD had begun a new strategy, which they called their sweet spot strategy. After the disaster of the 2900 XT, this huge, hot and loud card, AMD's Rick Bergman said in an interview with VentureBeat, "We recognised we could not continue on with huge die sizes. We were still working on the chip called the R600, that's the 2900 XT. And we were thinking of what we could do for the R700, and they decided that they just couldn't do another chip that was so big because of power consumption. So R670, the HD 3870, was a chip which came in between R600 and R700. It was less than half the size of R600, thanks mostly to the smaller node, and it also consumed much less power than the older 2900 XT. So the HD 3870 really was the start of AMD's sweet spot strategy. Much smaller, a little faster, much more power efficient. Just a win all round. The problem though? Again, AMD sadly weren't competing with themselves, they were competing with Nvidia's incredible 8000 series. And 10% faster than the old 2900 XT just wasn't enough to beat even the old 90nm Nvidia cards. And worse than that was, Nvidia had just got on to 65nm the month before, and they launched the famous 8800 GT. And that was the card which replaced my aging X1950 Pro. It was just that little bit faster again than the HD 3870, which led to AnandTech correctly lauding the 8800 GT as the only card that matters. But still, in the 3870 conclusion, Annan and Derek still reckoned that, without a doubt, AMD is back in the graphics game. While also noting that AMD is in a lot of trouble, however, if the 8800 GT pricing and availability problem does get worked out. The 8800 GT does offer better performance per watt and better performance in general, and at the same price the decision is clear. But Nvidia had a shortage going on there, and luckily for AMD, the two don't appear to be selling at the same price. The 8800 GT was based on the G92 chip, which was simply the 65nm shrink of G80, the 8800 GTX. But G92 was still very large due to the latter's huge die size. In fact, at 324 square millimeters, albeit on the slightly larger 65nm node, it was still 69% larger than the HD 3870's R670 chip. So yes, the 8800 GT was faster, it was more efficient, but it was also much, much larger. And this is why AMD were back in the graphics game. And the tiny size of R670 allowed them to stick two of them onto one board and finally retake the overall performance crown with the 3870 X2. It was far too long since AMD/ATI have been at the top of the performance charts. The crown had been lost on both CPU and GPU fronts, but the Radeon HD 3870 X2 changed that, at least on the GPU side. The Radeon HD 3870 X2 is the most elegant single-card multi-GPU design we've seen to date, and the performance is indeed higher than any competing single-card Nvidia solution out today. We all knew how Nvidia would respond to this threat. They'd go even larger than ever before. That's exactly what they did with the GT200, a humongous 576 square millimeter chip, headlined by the GTX 280. With this chip though, they were still on 65nm, and that was in the middle of 2008. Though a month later they would launch their first 55nm chip, the 9800 GTX Plus. But this was some 8 months after AMD had launched the 3870. This time though, it was Nvidia that had the problem, because AMD had just launched another 55nm chip, RV770, and their extremely successful HD 4800 series of cards. AMD were really on a roll now, and the 4800 series of cards went on to be some of their most successful ever. And from a technology perspective, you can see why. RV770 was 256 square millimeters, whereas G92B, that is the 9800 GTX Plus chip, it was 260 square millimeters. But the AMD card was almost 20% faster. It had DX10.1 against DX10, and it also had the world's first GDDR5 memory. So when I said that Terascale was surprisingly successful, I really meant it. In May 2007, they just launched the first Terascale card, the HD2900 XT. It was brutally bad and miles behind the Nvidia competition. Going through the HD 3870, and then on to the 4870 and 4850. Only 13 months later, in June 2008, they had taken the lead by far in technical metrics, and Nvidia only just held on to the outright single card lead due to the GTX 280's massive die size. If the 8800 GT was the only card that mattered in 2007, the 4870 was the only card that mattered in 2008. But AMD weren't done yet. In October 2009, they launched the HD 5000 series, the first 40nm chips, and the first DX11 cards. Codenamed Cypress, the HD 5870 had Nvidia reeling like never before. By AMD standards, this was a pretty large chip for a new process, coming in at 334 square millimeters. Of course, Nvidia knew that they couldn't afford to lose the outright crown, and they launched the massive 529 square millimeter Fermi chip GF100. But it was months late. It was a huge power hog, with a single GTX 480 consuming more power than the HD 5970, which was a dual chip 5870 card, and only just barely faster than the 5870. Spawning more memes than plaudits, Nvidia were on the ropes, and the GPU world waited on AMD's knockout blow coming with the HD 6970. But Nvidia actually got off the ropes instead, the GTX 580 fixing the woeful GTX 480's worst problems. while AMD appeared to have punched themselves out, releasing a very old and tired looking 6000 series for the Terascale swan song. It was a larger chip than Cypress, but it wasn't big enough. Now, I decided to cover this part of history for a couple of reasons. First is that I really enjoy this period of GPU history, and hopefully you can see why. Compared to what we have today with rebrands and higher prices every other year, we had real competition not only in technology, but also in pricing. If the cards weren't good enough, they were priced to reflect it. That's why the 2900 XT was so much cheaper than the 8800 GTX. But this is also interesting regarding Navi today. As I said at the top of the video, I wasn't exactly blown away by Navi's performance, power draw, and pricing as a whole. The performance is actually pretty good, especially for a chip of this size. It is only 251 square millimeters, and it gets really close to the 1080 Ti. The main problem for me though was the power draw, which is symptomatic of a fundamental issue at Radeon. Looking at Tech Power-Up's performance per watt chart again, we can see the 5700 XT has definitely been pushed out of its sweet spot because the 5700 non-XT is some 16% higher performance per watt. We don't really see this kind of thing with the Nvidia cards. Check out the 2060, the 2060 Super, and the 2070. All of those are based on the same GPU, yet there's only a couple of percentage points difference in performance per watt. And if we look at the 2070 Super and the 2080, again that's both the same GPU, we can see that the faster card is also more efficient. And even if we look at the 2080 Super now, the same chip just pushed that little bit further. The difference versus the non-pushed chip, the RTX 2080, is only 6%. So yeah, for sure it does look like AMD has pushed Navi 10, at least the 5700 XT, pretty far. So it's perhaps not a huge surprise to discover that yet again, the 5700 XT is something of an undervolting champion, with huge power savings possible there. What actually may be surprising though is, even though the XT is pushed past its sweet spot, it still appears to have some decent overclocking headroom too. And remember, we are talking about the reference cards here, so AIB cards could be quite nice, and if the rumoured Sapphire Toxic water-cooled is true, that could end up being a pretty compelling card, depending on the price of course. And pricing was the second major issue that I had with Navi, and that one is possibly even more interesting. Scott and I talked about Navi's pricing, and he put his point across pretty well, I thought. The thing for me here is, I am very much treating AMD as a whole unit, when in reality, every segment within AMD needs to operate on its own merits. The semi-custom division needs to make money, the CPU division needs to make money, and the same goes for the Radeon division. And while I wish we got cheaper graphics cards that were paid for by high-value, high-margin EPIC sales, that's just not how it works. Scott made it clear that there is simply no way the Radeon Technologies Group can make money on these cards at $200. $400? They can. And here's the thing, the 5700 XT at $400 is easily the best card at that price point. At $450, it was just too close to the 2070 Super. At $400, it becomes almost a no-brainer choice. This Super just isn't worth another $100. And I know I mentioned RTX previously in my RTX Superstars video, but there are some really nice technologies in the Radeon cards as well, and in the software. Right now I've got a 1080 Ti, and I've got a Radeon 7, and I choose to use the 7, simply because of Radeon Chill. Now it's also got anti-lag and image sharpening. Navi also has a new video encoder, which is apparently very impressive indeed. And Nvidia just recently admitted themselves that ray tracing won't be pervasive until 2023, and that somewhat diminishes RTX. But the problem with Navi, my problem with Navi, is, of course, I know that it's a mid-range 7nm chip with a higher than usual price tag. But it was Nvidia that set the price bar high with RTX, and AMD came in somewhat below it in the end. Nobody wishes more than me that Navi had come in at $300 or even $350, but in terms of competitive performance per dollar, it's hard to argue against it. We can see that over at Tech Power-Up's performance per dollar chart. And Tech Power-Up probably had one of the least flattering Navi reviews, but we can see that both cards, the XT and the 5700, have very compelling performance per dollar. Normally the cheaper cards do better here, that's why there's a bunch of lower end cards above it, but the XT and the non-XT are there, ahead of any Turing card apart from the 1660. So how can I argue against it? And the more I analysed all of this, the clearer the answers became. Back in the late 2000s and early 2010s, I remember how irritated I used to get reading the reviews of some of the tech press. Whenever ATI launched a new card on a new node, you'd often read in the conclusion that it might be worth waiting on Nvidia's X nanometer cards coming soon, or wait for Nvidia's response before buying this. And this annoyed me because, for one, being first to the new node is laudable. Somebody has to do it, otherwise nobody will. Time and again it was ATI, and then it was AMD. They put the effort and their expertise into being the first to the new node. Yet here the tech press were telling readers to wait anyway. Wait on Nvidia's larger, slightly faster chips? I mean, sure, you could do that. Had you waited on Nvidia's 80 nanometers, you only had to wait 3 months. However, it was a lower class of GPU in the case of the 7600 GT. The X1950 Pro was a much faster card. Had you waited on Nvidia's 55nm chip, you waited 8 months and it had backwards DX10 support. It didn't support DX10.1. Had you waited on Nvidia's 40nm cards, you waited on Fermi. That should have been enough to never wait again. 6 months later, and no, it was not worth the wait in any way, shape or form. So all that bugged me. And just recently, I realised that I have been doing the exact same thing. I said I didn't really want to review Navi because reviews are a massive pain in the arse. But I also didn't want to review it because I would have focused on the negatives. Sometimes you can have too much knowledge of something that you lose track of the important stuff. I have been down on Navi because I know that one day Nvidia will be on 7nm too, and Navi will quickly become low end. Or will it? What if Nvidia has another Fermi? Now, I don't for a minute believe that'll happen. In fact, they are pretty much guaranteed to shrink Turing and get phenomenal performance per watt again, in much the same way they did with Pascal. I don't expect another leap of that magnitude. What Nvidia did with Maxwell and Pascal was just unbelievable, and it's why AMD are toiling so far behind today. But again, that's just my belief. I don't actually know. So maybe they do end up doing another Fermi on 7nm. The point here is I just don't know. Even if I strongly suspect 7nm Turing is what we get, I just don't know for sure. And it's not fair of me to assume that, especially not in regards to our 5700 XT review. On top of that, how long do we have to wait anyway? 6 months? That's quite a long time, and Nvidia just launched their Super Series. It doesn't seem likely that they'll release another architecture this year, does it? And even if they do, and what I assume happens comes true, that is, Turing on 7nm blows Navi away. The point here is, it'll also be blowing the current Turings away. Sometimes you can look to the future too much and lose track of the fact that we have a present to live in. Navi needs to stand up against whatever the competition is at this time. In this case, it's Nvidia's 12nm supercards. And all this time I allowed my feelings of disappointment in the performance per watt of Navi to cloud my judgment here. All the while, Nvidia could end up releasing another Fermi on 7nm. And maybe even as far as a year away. It's a tough one. Perhaps AMD could communicate their 7nm lead a little bit better here. How far ahead are they? 4 months? 6 months? 9 months? A year? Mark Papermaster was keen to impress on us just how tough the 7nm lift was. Maybe if they're a year ahead, and they should come out and say that. The problem with that though is they do sometimes get that wrong. Like Raja got it wrong when he claimed Polaris would be the first FinFET card, before backtracking later to suggest he meant the first mid-range FinFET card after Nvidia actually launched Pascal first. But to finish this one off, looking back at when Terascale first launched with the 2900 XT, and it was a disaster. AMD's second worst GPU in history. I'll let you figure out which one is worst. But in the space of just over a year, they had taken a technological lead with the HD 4870. Based on the same architecture. Now, much of that was thanks to a full node and a half improvement going from 80nm to 55nm, and that isn't likely to happen over the next 3 years, let alone the next year. Things are also different today because Nvidia have shown that they are willing to push every boundary just to stay ahead. The Titan RTX, the 2080 Ti are 754 square millimeters of silicon. Back 10-15 years ago, these kind of die sizes were impossible. GT200 at 576 square millimeters, that was already huge, and it just managed to fend off the much smaller 4870. Fermi was huge again, and just managed to fend off the 5870. In both cases there, had AMD been a little more aggressive on die size with the new node, they could have won. And I think this is another aspect of Navi which disappointed me. Nvidia have shown since Kepler that the sweet spot die size is around that 300 square millimeter range, whereas AMD have been releasing a lot of chips around 220 square millimeters. If you consider that all the fixed function units take up a set amount of area, as do the memory controllers, that extra 80 or 90 square millimeters of area given over purely to shaders, that is really helping Nvidia. Now the 5700 XT and the non-XT are slightly larger than AMD's normal, at this 251 square millimeters, but the chip should have been closer to that 300 square millimeter mark. You think about that, this would have been enough to have beaten the RTX 2080 and possibly even the Super as well. Is it worth designing a chip around 250 square millimeters to go up against Nvidia's mid-range when they could have taken on and beaten the 2080, all for just a little bit more area? A 2080 beating Navi at around 300 square millimeters could justifiably have been priced closer to $600 or maybe even $500. Can you imagine 2080 beating performance at $500? And the extra cost in silicon would have been negligible. At some point, AMD is going to have to start fighting these battles again, the way they did with Cypress. They've got to get back up to this 300 square millimeter range, or they're going to have to start doing what Nvidia does and go enormous really late on the node, in the same way that Nvidia did with Turing. But of course, the real problem is the power draw. And of course, the real issue is money, which has been a massive problem for the Radeon Technologies group. So I guess with that in mind, I can just about accept the higher than usual prices. Personally, I won't be buying a 5700 XT because I'm still not convinced it's worth $400. But with that said, if I were buying a $400 card, it would have to be the 5700 XT because it's the best value card at that price range. So Navi, it is a weird one for me. It's impressive that they got pretty close to the 1080 Ti at only 251 square millimeters. It's less impressive in that it took similar power levels to get there. In many ways, it's a mid-range card with higher end power draw and pricing. The prices don't impress me, yet are still somehow a lot better than anything Nvidia has offered in some time. On the software side, the AMD cards pull further ahead. Stuff like image sharpening and Radeon anti-lag, and also Fidelity FX. All the while Nvidia does, I don't know what, DLSS? And of course RTX. But Nvidia really need to overhaul their software big time. And again, I'll mention Radeon Chill because even if you don't use it in every game, there are surely some games where it works a treat. And that easily turns around the performance per watt loss under normal usage. And finally, well, let's be frank. You'd be supporting AMD rather than Nvidia, which is priceless. Right, I am on vacation and this time I am taking one, starting with a week at the villa, beginning tomorrow. I'll mostly be unplugged though. I am taking my laptop with me to read up on some other topics and maybe do a bit of programming as well. That's what I do for relaxation these days. You might even see a tutorial or two on that one day. In the meantime, check out the website and I'll be back in a couple of weeks. I'll catch you later, guys.